The founding of the towns of Hamburg, Howell, and Toonerville, Missouri can be traced back as far as the 1830s, but one would have to look as far back as 18th century Europe to understand exactly how these three Missouri towns came to exist. In 1799, a gifted French military tactician became de facto ruler of the French Republic, setting himself on a path which nearly led to total domination of Europe. History will remember this Frenchman as Napoleon Bonaparte, and his conquest of Europe was unlike anything the world has seen since the times when Asia and Eastern Europe were ravaged by one of my own ancestors, Temujin, who you might know by his more commonly recognized name, Genghis Khan. What later became known as the Napoleonic Wars not only led to mass loss of life, the likes of which would not be seen again on the European continent until the rise and fall of Hitler's so-called Third Reich, but it also led to mass emigration of Europeans, either seeking refuge from a war-torn land, or seeking to either escape compulsory military service themselves, or protect their draft-age children from being conscripted into fighting a war that, by all indications, they had very little chance of returning home from. Now, Napoleon might have died in 1821, but the aftershocks of his military campaigns were felt for decades. Culturally, economically, he left many a European seeking greener pastures. Known as the New World and the melting pot of nations, America caught many of these immigrants, and this included many immigrants of Germanic heritage. In fact, one needs not look far in the United States to see German cultural influences on our everyday lives. Brewing, architecture, brewing, music, brewing. In fact, this is how America came to be home to such influential business magnates and entrepreneurs as Levi Strauss, Franz Rudolf Wurlitzer, and St. Louis, Missouri's own Adolphus Busch and Johann Adam Lemp. Even before being admitted to the Union in 1821, Missouri was a favorite place for German immigrants to settle down. While pioneers and immigrants of other ethnicities continued westward, many a German settler needed but to look at the rolling hills, lush landscapes, and fertile fields of the Missouri Territory to be reminded of home. In fact, 1824 saw the arrival of one such German immigrant named Gottfried Duden, who settled near the location of present-day Dutzow, Missouri. In 1826, he returned to Germany to tell everyone he knew that this new land was exactly like the Rhine, and that they should come build new lives in what he called the Missouri Rhineland. By 1830, German immigration to America had begun in earnest. Many were sold on their predecessor stories of the Missouri Rhineland, a place where hard-working German farmers could build new lives for their families, in a land which looked so much like the home they were forced to leave behind for one reason or another. As was common practice at that time, a settler or homesteader, in order to stake his claim, would be required to find a piece of unclaimed land, stake out the section he wanted, build a dwelling, and farm that land for at least a year in order to raise a viable crop, thereby demonstrating his willingness to work and maintain that land. Once this was completed, the local government would officially certify that claim to be under the ownership of the claimant who had just spent the last year or so working that land. Not only was this a sweet deal for the 18th and 19th century American settlers, it was an especially good deal for migrants who had just left their homes far behind in a war-torn land, in many cases barely walking away with whatever the entire family could fit into a single trunk. It was also a common practice at the time for your average homesteader to leave his family behind in a safer, well-established community, sometimes as far away as New York, where America's most frequently used port of entry was at that time. While he would go out and stake his claim, build a home for his family, and turn his new land into a workable farm. Just think back to John Marston's epilogue in Red Dead Redemption 2, how he had the home all built up and the farm functioning long before Abby and Jack ever arrived. Getting back to St. Charles, though. While St. Charles itself was settled by the French in 1766, St. Charles County didn't exist until the War of 1812 began in, well, 1812. It was in this year that the Missouri Territory began to organize individual counties, such as St. Charles County, St. Louis County, Warren County, etc. In 1839, the settlement of Howell was founded by an educator named Francis Howell. It's funny, I'd always been under the impression that Francis and Howell were two different people. So I'd always referred to Francis Howell as Francis Howell instead of Francis Howell, and no one ever noticed. The following year, in 1840, the town of Hamburg was settled, this time by a group of German immigrants. The original location of Hamburg was an ideal trading hub for local farmers, due to being located not only close to the Missouri River, but also being located along the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad line, or the MKT, which would much later become the Katy Trail. The main location of Hamburg changed in 1844 when its founders learned the true magnitude of a little magic trick the Missouri River likes to perform on an annual basis, called seasonal flooding. 1844 was the year of the Great Flood of the Missouri River Valley, and the town's residents and founders quickly learned that the river, which served as one of the town's mercantile lifelines, could also spell the town's doom. Before 1844, Hamburg was one small town located below the bluffs overlooking the river and the MKT rail line. When they realized regular flooding was going to be an issue, much of the town was moved and rebuilt atop the bluffs, for the most part leaving behind only the Hamburg train depot and a few steadfast residents who were unwilling or unable to relocate. This led to the town being divided into two segments, Upper Hamburg and Lower Hamburg. Despite all the hardships endured by our pioneering ancestors here in Missouri, the Great Flood of 1844, the cholera outbreak of 1849, the invention of the postage stamp, the people of Hamburg stood strong. Not only a testament to the state and thereby the nation that they were helping to build, but also as a testament to the hardy, steadfast lineage which they had brought with them from the Old World. A durability and determination that one rarely finds outside of the Germanic clans, the West African tribes, the Nordic clans, or a pissed-off Scotsman after someone has just insulted his mum. Life was good for the townsfolk of Hamburg and Howell. Hell, in 1881, Howell even opened up the Howell Institute, the grandfather of the Francis Howell School District, so both towns now had access to an accredited educational facility. This might also explain why during the filming of my original unpublished Randonautica video, the GPS said that I was in the Francis Howell School District while I was actually standing in the middle of the August Busch Wildlife Reserve. The location of the town of Howell now makes up a small portion of bush wildlife, as the Busch Wildlife Reserve is actually made up of over 6,000 acres of lands originally acquired for the construction of the Weldon Spring Ordnance Works, but which seem to have gone unused in that project. Even when the Great Depression started in 1929, farming communities still fared much better than the cities. City folk relied mainly on meats and vegetables to be brought into the cities via train and wagon, as not a lot of companies at the time were sold on the idea of the internal combustion engine. They still relied on the affordable, low-maintenance horse-drawn carriage, while country folk and farmers had access to the foods they themselves were producing. Plus, with the scarcity of expensive fuels and high costs involved in acquiring long-range transportation at the time, Combined with the seclusion of farming communities such as Hamburg, basically outside of the railroads, St. Charles County didn't even have direct roads connecting to the St. Louis area until the Daniel Boone Bridge was completed in 1937. So the idea of city folk raiding farms for food was a rather far-fetched idea, especially when it was much easier to wait near the rail yards and just raid the produce trains as they rolled in. Hell, as a kid, I used to listen to the old folks tell stories of how they would raid the trains as they were pulling into Produce Row in North St. Louis. They made it sound less like providing for their starving families and more like harmless, jolly fun. Unfortunately, the true tragedy struck Howell, Hamburg, and Toonerville when Adolf Hitler declared war on the world. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, he set forth a chain of events that would forever change the social, political, and economical climates of the entire planet. For the first time in human history, each and every nation was vulnerable, whether they were involved in the war or not. Seeing war on the horizon, and that America's involvement was inevitable, the United States began to turn its manufacturing industries to a wartime footing. Home appliance factories were retooled to produce infantry equipment. Clothiers began to roll out uniforms, while textile factories produced tents and other types of canvas-walled buildings. Automotive manufacturers retooled to produce armored vehicles, infantry transports, cargo trucks, and the like. This would also explain why, on occasion, you can still happen across an antique Jeep, which carries the badge of the Ford Motor Company. Because during wartime production, if your factory could make something that was needed on the front, it damned well made it, and copyrights and trademarks could go to hell. While the United States did have plenty of arms manufacturers like Remington Outdoor Company, Winchester Repeating Arms, Browning Arms, what it lacked was a large-scale producer of explosive ordnance. World War I was known as a trench war, men fighting men in the trenches, guns blazing. Aerial combat was present, but not overly so, and aside from an occasional pilot getting the bright idea to drop a hand grenade out of his cockpit from low altitude, aerial bombing was only theoretical at that time. And as for the tank was more of a novelty, a scare tactic, a large metal beast which was unleashed upon the battlefield to show enemy troops an unstoppable monster, though a monster which was primarily armed with machine guns. The same could not be said of World War II. Military aircraft by then had become much more sophisticated than their biplane counterparts from prior decades. These craft were designed with specialized classes in mind, and each class had a specific purpose, such as the bomber. Then there's the tank, powerful, heavily armored, designed to combat other heavily armored vehicles of the same type. And all of these machines needed compact, high-yield explosive ordnance in order to be effective on the battlefield. And the United States required a facility capable of mass-producing the ordnance needed for its tanks and bombers, as well as for its naval and field artillery. But military strategists also understood the need for seclusion and security. Building that facility too near the coastal regions would leave it susceptible to both sabotage and aerial bombardment. Hell, just look at the events of December 7th, 1941 as a prime example. The Japanese Imperial Navy proved without a doubt how easy it was to sneak up on and attack an American military installation. Early warning radar detection was still in its infancy at that time, and highly unreliable. And by the time ground spotters could positively identify incoming enemy aircraft, the attack would have been mere seconds from commencing. What the American military machine needed was an ordnance plant in the nation's heartland, beyond the range of enemy aircraft of the time, capable of mass-producing the ordnance needed to keep America and her allies knee-deep in all the boom-booms and bang-bangs their little hearts desired. The Council of National Defense had many places scouted, and the perfect location for the future ordnance works was discovered. It was isolated from the nearest cities, it was in the central United States, far from the coast, it had access to an established railroad line and freight depot, as well as access to a riverboat landing, in case it became necessary to move cargo or personnel via the waterways. And the area was rich in limestone, which could be quarried for building material for the ordnance works. Unfortunately, 3 established communities stood in the way of this project. Equally unfortunate is the fact that established communities had never stopped the U.S. government before.
My dear Mr. Secretary, under the provisions of the Act of September 9th, 1940, and upon the recommendation of the Council of National Defense and the Advisory Commission thereof, I hereby give my approval to the following project under the War Department Program for expediting production in connection with existing national defense programs. Construction of a TNT and D&T plant at Weldon Springs, Missouri, costing $14,500,000. Sincerely yours, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 17 October, 1940.
By September of 1940, President Roosevelt had given his seal of approval for the National Defense Project, which would create an ordnance factory at Weldon Springs, Missouri, acquiring 17,232 acres of land to do so. The only obstacles now were the construction of the ordnance works itself, and of course, getting rid of all the pesky people who owned the land where the ordnance works was to be built.
And then it happened. That dreadful headline. $11 million for TNT plant. Those big black letters stood out like a smudge of dirt on a nurse's uniform. The article stated that a TNT plant was to be located in the southeastern part of St. Charles County. That's where we live. Surely they're not going to take this beautiful countryside and build a TNT plant. Yes, the article said some 18,000 acres of land would be acquired for that purpose. That will take in all of this part of the county. Better go over and see what my neighbor thinks of this. There must be some mistake. Everyone said it was a mistake. No one told us that this land might be taken for that purpose. Surely we would have heard something about it. Just one of those mistakes those city papers make nowadays. The Rape of Howell in Hamburg, Missouri, written by Donald Muscany in 1978.
Through the use of lowball monetary offers, legal threats, and eminent domain, also known in Missouri as outright land theft, the residents of Howell, Hamburg, and Toonerville were either bought out, chased out, or in some cases kicked out, being given just 3 months to pack up their entire lives and the histories of their forebears, many times stepping out of their lifelong homes just in time for the demolition crews to set everything they ever knew ablaze the moment they walked out the door. Construction of the Weldon Spring Ordnance Works proceeded at such a rapid pace that by 1941, parts of the facility were already going into full production, pushing out TNT and D&T products at breakneck speeds, which I suppose was a good thing, as not only was the United States able to build its own ordnance stockpiles, but in March of 1941, FDR had signed the Lend-Lease Bill, providing material aid to Great Britain in her fight against the Nazi invaders, as well as providing some aid to the Soviet Union and China. But back home in Missouri, the waiting game had just begun for some 700 farmers, businessmen, and their families. From 1941 to 1945, the Weldon Spring Ordnance Works cranked out TNT and DNT explosives at speeds which would have made any powder monkey's toes curl. 4 production lines dedicated to TNT products, plus 2 more dedicated to DNT, meant that our Allied artillery, tanks, and bombers would be well fed throughout the entire war. And still, many residents of Howell, Hamburg, and Toonerville waited for what the government had promised them when they kicked them off their lands. But as anyone who studies American history can tell you, the U.S. government is not known for its willingness to keep the promises it makes to Americans.
I owned a farm in the area consisting of 161 acres, with this new modern improvements on it, built in 1936 to 1940. The farm was in the outlying area, and it was never used for war purposes. The buildings and fences were destroyed, and the land was rented for agricultural purposes. Payments were withheld on half of the contracts due to the difficulties with the War Department. The property was taken over by the War Department in the fall of 1940, and we were paid in the late summer of 1945, but we were forced to go to Supreme Court for a decision. We had been without a home all this time. Now, when we were paid, there was such inflation that very little could be bought with the money acquired from the sale of the farm. After all those huge expenses, the courts, attorney's fees, etc. were all taken off. We've been without a home all this time, and we'd like very much to reacquire ours. What's the procedure should we follow? Well, we feel that we were part of the war machinery that helped bring the war to a successful ending, and that our contribution was no small one. We feel that the property on the outlying area was devoted to agricultural purposes should be returned to the former owners, to enable them to start life over again. T. Woodson, date unknown.
Wartime production of TNT and DNT led to nitroaromatic contamination of soil, groundwater, and springs in the area, requiring years of environmental remediation between 1945 and 1955, when 200 acres of the former Ordnance Works were transferred to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission for construction of the Weldon Spring Uranium Feeds Material Plant, later known as the Weldon Spring Chemical Plant. This new uranium plant operated from 1957 to 1966, converting uranium ore into uranium tetrafluoride, uranium trioxide, and uranium metal, and also processed small amounts of thorium, as during the 1960s several countries were experimenting with thorium-based reactors, such as the one which was being tested at the Indian Point Energy Center in Buchanan, New York. But, as does tend to happen when humans fuck around to find out, the operation of the uranium plant led to radiological contamination of the area. The uranium plant ceased operations in 1966. Evidently not understanding the magnitude of the radiological contamination they had caused, on December 31, 1967, the Atomic Energy Commission returned control of the facility to the U.S. Army in order to convert it into a production plant for defoliants, or what you and I would think of as herbicides on crack. Probably Agent Orange, which was frequently used during America's time in the Vietnam conflict. Mixed with dioxin and administered to jungle flora, this chemical cocktail could rapidly kill off trees and foliage, leaving little in the way of cover and concealment for soldiers who were specially trained in jungle warfare. Luckily, this defoliant project was scrapped before it ever made it off the drawing board, and the Army transferred 50-plus acres of irradiated lands back to the Atomic Energy Commission, while retaining control of the chemical plant itself. Due to the radiological contamination, the AEC and the U.S. Department of Energy maintained control over the site, including that of the chemical plant, from 1968 through 1985. And although the Army did make efforts to repair and decontaminate the chemical plant, in 1984 they transferred full custody of the plant to the Department of Energy. It was then that the Department of Energy declared decontamination and cleanup of the site a major environmental remediation project. This is where the Weldon Spring Quarry comes into play. The quarry was originally used to source limestone aggregate for the construction of the Ordnance works, saving both time and money by sourcing building materials locally rather than having to purchase and then ship them in. But after the plant was completed, the quarry was then used as a disposal site and burn pit for the byproducts of TNT and DNT production, leading to the area's nitroaromatic contamination. In 1958, the Army transferred control of the quarry to the Atomic Energy Commission, who then used it from 1959 to 1966 as a disposal site for uranium, thorium, and radium residues from the chemical plant, both barreled and uncontained, as well as contaminated rubble, equipment, and soil from the demolition of a former uranium processing plant located in St. Louis, Missouri. As nearly as I can tell, but don't quote me on this is what I believe eventually became the Weldon Spring Uranium Disposal Site, which would later become the Weldon Spring Site Interpretive Center, which is a massive containment structure built atop a radioactive disposal pit, which was gradually filled up during the many years of environmental remediation and cleanup. 700 plus farmers, businessmen, teachers, and their families, forced from their homes, their lands taken, their towns destroyed, their lands contaminated, promises made, promises broken, all to feed a global conflict that need not have even happened. So many dreams shattered, so many lives forever changed, so many lies stamped with official seals of approval, and so many whispers of the past struggling to be heard even today over the hustle and bustle of the modern men and women who pass to and fro on Highway 94, unaware or unconcerned with the voices of yesterday, desperate to tell their stories to any who are willing to stop for just a moment and listen.